Greetings to everyone. Uh, Welcome to the 16th webinar of Anekdhara. This month's topic is Executive, Legislature and Judiciary. Where is the Lakshmana Rekha? Before we go into the webinar proper, I'll say a few words about Anekdhara. Anekdhara, as most of you know, is set up by a group of retired civil servants as a forum to discuss important public policy issues. Though we were diffident in the start, we were received well. We were clear that there are many things where opinions are not black and white, they are gray. There is a nuanced discussion, place for nuanced discussion. And we were also upset with what is appearing most of the social media with reference to lack of nuanced discussion, clear and circulation of a lot of fake news or half truths. So we wanted to have a deeper discussion with experts who have worked on the area for a long period. So like that, we also have a very good panel here. And before I go into that, we also received great help from various of you audience in identifying speakers and topics. So in continuation to that, and to streamline that and also systematize, we are planning to start a support group whose link we'll share in the chat box of YouTube. And you, if you are interested in giving us suggestions or comments on where we are doing, you're most welcome and you can join that group. With this, we'll go on to the webinar. Executive, Legislature, Judiciary, and Judiciary, where is the Lakshmana Rekha? So we have expert panel consisting of Justice Chelameswar and Sri Dushyant and moderated by Sri A.K. Srivastava. I'll introduce the moderator, Sri A.K. Srivastava, and then he will take the webinar forward. Sri A.K. Srivastava belongs to the IRTS 1982 joining, and he retired in highest position possible in the cadre in the zone, that is the Chief Operations Manager, followed by working as Additional General Manager of a railway. He is also not only interested in working in the railways, but he has also a lot of penchant for railway heritage, history, and urban history. And he has other 2 books on double railway lines and Borghat and Tulghat construction areas. In addition, he has an interest in law, and he has completed his LLB in addition to his MA in political science, and worked as Vice Chairman of Railway Claims Tribunal, which is a tribunal for all claims related to railway working. So that's why he has a lot of and his interest is seen in many of his writings on the legal matters also. So that's the reason why we have selected him as the moderator. Sir, thank you very much for joining, and over to you.
Thank you so much. So good morning to all of you who are joining us today. And we have 2 very eminent speakers with us. Sri Ravi Babu has already introduced about the function of Anekdhara. And let me very briefly talk about the topic that I will hand it over to the eminent speakers. In England, amidst the clash of arms, the laws are not silent. When Lord Atkin uttered these words in Liversis versus Anderson, he actually drew a Lakshmana Rekha and prevented the encroachment of executive authority on the independence of citizenry. But much before that, in 18th century, to be precise, 1748, when Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of Laws, he clearly delineated the concept of separation of powers and held that unless a judge, authority of judge, is not clearly separated from legislature and executive, there is no freedom. The concept of separation of power was clearly established as a basic feature in Keshwanand Bharati. But much before that, when our constitution makers were drafting the constitution, it was woven into the fabric of our constitution. And they anointed judiciary with the power of judicial review. Grenville Austin, while writing his seminal work, The Indian Constitution, Cornerstone of a Nation, he wrote a chapter on judiciary. He begins with a quote from a constitutional father: "The seat of justice is the seat of God." And it shows the respect and responsibility which the constitution makers entrusted upon the judiciary. And the title of the chapter in Austin's book is Judiciary and the Social Revolution. Is also very telling. And it underlines the transformative nature of Indian Constitution and how judiciary is aligned with it. Judicial review, assembly members believed, is the essential power of courts of free India. And it was taken not only when the chapter of Supreme Court and chapter related with judiciary was being drawn. It was discussed, deliberated, and decided when fundamental rights were written. Article 25, which is now Article 32, when it was passed, M. Anantchanam Iyengar hailed it by saying, "The Supreme Court, according to me, is the supreme guardian of citizens' right in any democracy. I would even go further and say that it is the soul of democracy." I need not repeat it, but M. Anantchanam Iyengar was the first deputy speaker of Lok Sabha. And after the untimely demise of the Malvalankar, he became the speaker of the first Lok Sabha. So a person who headed the first Lok Sabha, headed the legislature, had this view about the Supreme Court, that it is the supreme guardian of citizens' rights and it is the soul of democracy. And the rights on which Supreme Court stands as a sentinel, they go far beyond liberty. They include rights against exploitation, rights of minority, right to equality, and that make our constitution a transformative constitution. And Supreme Court has aligned itself by reading the right of privacy, right of dignity, along with the right of life. In a parliamentary democracy, the role of legislature and executive are quite merged, fused. But as far as judiciary is concerned, constitution makers not only drew a Lakshmana Rekha for the protection of citizens, but made courts responsible for that, to hold that line under Article 32, as there is no right without a remedy. But we are today at crossroads. As in the beginning of this seminar, Srivastava Babu mentioned, many times we are reminded of Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. With the selective application of law, when an earth-moving equipment first reads the nameplate and then roars or steps back diffidently with a bowed head, a comedian is incarcerated even before cracking his first joke. A lady law intern is attacked in the very court where she is trying to learn the ropes of law, but again arrested, and for the bail she has to come to apex court. It's a very different type of situation. Many times we feel like Joseph K., a Kafkaesque word from the Kafka's famous novel Trial, helpless in the face of an incomprehensible system. And then drawing a Lakshmana Rekha and holding that Lakshmana Rekha becomes a very important task. Makers of the constitutions have entrusted it to the constitutional courts. And in the backdrop of this, we are going to have today's discussion by two eminent speakers. And it is not only topical, but have a long-term significance. But before I invite our honored speakers, let me again reminisce for a minute about the composition of committee of 5 members who drafted provisions related to Supreme Court. It was composed of both members of bench and bar. It was headed by a former judge of federal court, and 4 other members were from the bar. D.L. Mittal was the former Advocate General, and Vanchu, Munshi, and Iyer were the advocates of distinction. So again, when today we are discussing this situation, we have both bar and bench together. And I feel we, the people who have entrusted us this constitution, who have created the Lakshmana Rekha, bar and bench together, will be able to hold this line very well. And the first speaker will be our Justice J. Chelameswar. Let me introduce him very briefly. He does not need any introduction, but it's an honor for me to invite him to address us. He is the former judge of Supreme Court of India, retired on 22nd June 2018 as the second senior most Supreme Court judge. He was the Chief Justice of Kerala, Guwahati High Court, and he will always be remembered for judgments like Shreya Singhal, which struck down 66A, and Puthuswamy case, where by his separate judgment, he concretized the right of privacy by providing specific standards. The former law minister, Shanti Bhushan, hailed him for his courage, conduct, judicial approach, and uprightness. He went on to list him as one of the greatest judges the court has ever produced. Sri Chelameswar is a voracious reader, has a passion for Telugu literature, among other things, a stickler for accountability and transparency, and he's one of the few who walk the talk. Like his judgments, his dissenting views are also well known. Has often been called as a dissenter. But dissenting voices of Justice Holmes, Lord Etkin, and closer home of Justice Khanna, whose picture still hangs in the court number 2, they ring more loudly for the future generations. And sometimes they reverberate and they're heard. So at the time when a fierce debate is raging on the role of the judiciary, sir, it would be a privilege to listen to you. So Justice J. Chelameswar, please.
Thank you, Mr. Srivastava. Thanks for the kind words you said about me. I wish I really deserved each one of them. Anyway, leave it there. This cliche of Lakshmana Rekha, I don't remember exactly when it crept into the legal language, but it's been in vogue for quite a few decades. Mr. Srivastava was saying that the framers of the Constitution and the second speaker, the first deputy speaker, Mr. Anekdhara, believed that, said in so many words, that the Supreme Court would be the guardian of all the liberties of the people. It was a pious hope. In fact, a more rational and profound statement was made almost 100 years before that by an eminent jurist called Joseph Story, whose commentaries on the American Constitution are iconic. Maybe 150 years after they were written, it lost some of its iconic status because of changes that have come about and equally important works that have come about. But Story's book is a great work, a very profound book. I'm not very fond of quoting. If you notice my judgments, barring at times when I find that my expression itself is inadequate to meet the situation, and quoting might improve the quality of my writing. I quote, otherwise, I never believed in quoting things, but leave it there. Joseph Story said about the American Constitution, I don't remember the statement, but he said something like this: the structure is complete, its arrangements are beautiful, its defenses are impregnable from without. Then it goes on like this, and finally he says, nonetheless, it may perish within an hour of the folly of its own keepers, the people. If the people are not vigilant and they don't take care of their liberties and their constitution, no Supreme Court, no judge can preserve those liberties, those rights. See, but more than once I said it in various occasions. Democracy does not only mean numbers. It is said that democracy only means numbers and majority. The killing of Socrates was the most democratic act. The entire citizenry of Athens gathered and found him guilty of, what it was, and then sentenced him to death. The most democratic, it's not an individual judge like Chelameswar or the Supreme Court or a High Court. The whole citizenry of the city of Athens, they gathered and found man to be guilty of preaching wrong ideas to the youngsters. And then he was sentenced to death. So afterwards, what can any court or anybody do about it? Nothing. It's ultimately with the people. Nonetheless, human genius invented systems for a period of millennia. And at some stage, it was realized by thinkers. What Mr. Srivastava was mentioning about Montesquieu and his book. People realize that concentration of power in an individual or even in an institution is not always very beneficial to the people, and certainly not good for the liberty of. Therefore, they saw a need to separate the powers, though it's an evolution, historical evolution in England. And initially, the king was found to be the personification of all the power, which was divine, which he had the power to make the laws, execute the laws, and also dispense justice. Now, the trouble started with the making of the laws. The king was making laws as he pleased, and most of the time, the trouble starts with money. It all started with the taxation, taxing power. Then people, of course, once again, we've got to be a little careful today in the 21st century when we talk about people. When people resisted, it was those property people who found it difficult for them. Man without any property, taxation really doesn't trouble. What troubles him is only his hunger. Now it was the people with properties who resisted the power. But then that's how institutions develop. They resisted the authority of the king to raise taxes as it pleased. They wanted a say in the matter. That's how the parliamentary democratic system came into existence in England. Now, much later, when the American Federation was formed, people realized since they didn't have a king, they don't have a king even today in the formal sense of it. The modern day rulers are much more than kings. That's a different story. They thought there should be something more paramount than an ordinary law made by the transient majorities of the people. There are some inviolable principles which are required to be asserted once for all. Therefore, written constitutions came into existence. And for the first time, the American Supreme Court, the famous judgment of John Marshall, said that it was emphatically the province of the Supreme Court to interpret whether a particular law is consistent with the fundamental law of the nation and the Constitution. That's how the doctrine of judiciary was developed. These are all various checks and balances which evolved over a period of time on the concentration of power and abuse of the power. That's how these things evolved. Now, when we talk about Lakshmana Rekhas, it's a peculiar Indian expression. Now, parliaments, the legislative bodies, if most of the people, since anyway, I'm going to understand that most of the members of organization of former civil servants, they do have, some of them might be excellent lawyers also, some of them might have received good legal education also, but in practice. There must be some non-lawyers, and others are also perhaps watching this program. But those who are not very acquainted with law, I may tell them, in a day-to-day life, we see in any system of government, whether it's a dictatorial government or an autocratic government or a democratic government. Once again, in democracy, there are various shades of democracy. What we call ours is a Westminster model democracy. Well, American system is also democracy where the president is elected directly by the people. That's also democracy. Whereas, whatever is the form of the government, in all these democracies, the first check first of all, we see a glorified personality at the head of the executive. Be it the President of America, be it the Prime Minister of India, or the Prime Minister of Britain, any country, whatever you take. A glorified personality, more often people who enjoy huge amount of popular support. And people only look at them as some kind of wielders of power. But strictly in constitutional theory, the members of the executive are only there to implement the laws made by the parliament, by the legislative bodies. We see the glory in that naked power where the heads of the state are received on red carpets and all the pomp that goes with the status of the head of the state. But in theory, if you look at it, what is the role of the executive in a democratic system? The lawmakers make a law. The members of the executive government, a permanent executive or a representative executive elected periodically, their role is only to enforce the law made by the legislative bodies. Because in the process, they wield enormous power of making and unmaking things. Therefore, people pray for that role. Now, in a system on principle, Parliament is the first check on the abuse of power of the executive. It is in theory, the executive is always described as somebody which is accountable to the legislative body, the Parliament, or state legislature, as the case may be, depending upon the nature of the setting. The first check is the parliamentary audit of the executive action. But over a period of time, what happened is that membership of the parliament depended upon party systems and not on the individual strength of the members of the legislative bodies. Some of them might be very powerful in their own constituencies or otherwise also this thing. But overall, it is a party which matters in this. And once you create such a system, which has come into existence, nobody created it, or by practice it is come into existence, that first check becomes a doubtful check because people vote on party lines. And any decision in the legislative bodies regarding the correctness of executive action is not decided on rational parameters, but on party lines. Coupled with this limitation on which is crept into the democratic practices, in India, we have an additional problem. There are justifications for everything. Additional problem is the introduction of the 10th schedule. Even if somebody not that every member of the legislature who disagrees with his party is doing it on very pious grounds or rational grounds. They might have their own personal reasons. But the fact remains, what little opportunity is there for the members of the legislature to hold the executive for account is diminished with the introduction of the 10th schedule, and which makes, once a whip is issued, any member violating the whip would face the consequence of losing his membership of the legislature. That became a totally ineffective check there for the parliamentary supervision or audit. Next is the laws made by the parliament or legislative bodies and the administrative actions of the executive while implementing or purporting to implement those laws are in theory and in practice also made amenable to the judicial review of the constitutional courts and the systems of written constitution. In England, the legislative action is not strictly amenable to the judicial review. But in America, Canada, India, and other countries, even the legislative action is amenable to judicial review to the extent that whether in classical sense, to the extent whether the law made by the legislature is strictly in compliance with the fundamental law of the nation, that is the Constitution. Now, this is the arrangement. Thing is, if we believe that the Constitution, the mandates contained in the Constitution are inviolable. Repeatedly, we have heard arguments in this country from the beginning, 1951 onwards, that Parliament is sovereign, it can amend the Constitution. Well, those arguments were heard, and eventually, when the Supreme Court said in case of, I don't know whether it's stated, once again, questions are being raised by here nowadays, said that there are some basic features of the Constitution which are not amenable to the amendatory power of the Constitution, the Parliament. What the Supreme Court said is there are some values which are part of the Constitution which go beyond the transient majoritarian decisions. That no man shall be deprived of his life or liberty save by law. Law means it should also be a reasonable law, not any law. Otherwise, we have a huge majority in the Parliament. And if the Parliament tomorrow makes a law that all the dark-skinned people should be put to death, it would strictly be a law made into the power of the Constitution. But then, as I was mentioning about Socrates, this is that kind of a law. So therefore, to make sure that the majorities don't indulge in this kind of lawmaking, constitutions are made, and then there are some fundamental ideas, principles, values which are impregnated there. It becomes the obligation of the healthy judiciary to protect those values. In fact, normally, I would like to just as an illustration, I'm telling you, I'm not trying to advertise my work. In that privacy judgment, I made one statement, if you noticed it. The argument before the court on behalf of the government of India was that the word privacy doesn't occur in the text of the Constitution, therefore there is no fundamental right of privacy. That was the argument. In fact, I met this argument by saying, American Constitution contains a specific provision saying that no cruel and unusual punishment shall be awarded. There is a specific provision there. Indian Constitution doesn't contain such a provision. If this argument of advanced by the state were to be accepted in principle, nothing prevents the Parliament or the state legislature under the Constitution to make a law imposing the punishment of maiming for theft or rape or whatever it is. Because the Constitution doesn't say no unusual or cruel punishment shall be awarded. But then, are we willing to live in a state like that is a question. That's what I wrote in the judgment. And it's a serious question. Kindly think it over. Everything must be tested on logic and experience. There's a famous statement in law, Courtesy says, the life of law is not logic, but experience. So in experience, what happens? Now, how to protect those basic values, that's what Chelameswar is saying. There are some inviolable things. Don't transgress things. You have the power to make laws very well. Subject to certain limitations, well, we have a huge amount of play in the joints there in making the law. But beyond this, you don't have. Now, what exactly are these features, these basic features? Is a matter, Chelameswar, in this case, never made it very elaborate. So it can't be made. Situations are always dynamic. You'll have to examine as in the matter, though there is some broad indication. Now, of late, the last couple of decades, whenever the legislature, the political party wields a huge majority in the legislative bodies, they come out with a statement saying that the judiciary is crossing the Lakshmana Rekha. What is the Lakshmana Rekha? Well, I really don't know. What is the Lakshmana Rekha? I'm not saying that there is no Lakshmana Rekha, quote unquote. Judiciary has a defined role under any constitutional system. When it seeks to cross that line, certainly it is impermissible and necessary corrective measures have to be taken. But now, more or less, this is used as some kind of a rhetorical statement. Whatever I don't like, whatever decision of the judiciary which the executive or members of the legislature do not like, they believe that the judiciary has crossed the line. And a dispassionate inquiry in a given case, it's possible. I'm not saying that the judiciary never crossed the line. There have been instances which requires a full-fledged debate where it crossed and where it did not cross. That's another matter. But what happens more often is these are rhetorical statements. Now, the Lakshmana Rekha, insofar as the judiciary is concerned, for all the bodies, to that matter, not only judiciary, is the Constitution itself. But what exactly the Constitution says, what are those fine principles which underlie the express text of the Constitution, is a matter which requires a more deeper analysis. And judiciary as a body comprising of men and women supposedly trained in the art of interpreting laws would be better suited to define what are the limits of these various bodies. The only Lakshmana Rekha, according to me, for any one of these three bodies is the Constitution itself. And I think with these words, I'll stop it here and hand it over to my friend, Mr. Dushyant. Yes, Mr. Dave. I think maybe there's a formality of introduction, Mr. Dave. Yes, Mr. Srivastava.
Good morning, everybody. Justice Chelameswar, Mr. Srivastava, Mr. Ravi Babu, distinguished members and followers of Anekdhara, dear citizen friends, ladies and gentlemen. On a Sunday morning, this is too serious a topic to debate. But let us try and understand what this is about, more so after some very illuminating thoughts that have been expressed by Justice Chelameswar. Justice Chelameswar was always an original thinker. And as he rightly said, he never quoted anybody because he didn't need to. He always had his original ideas, which he put them in his judgments. And those judgments today make an extremely lucid and enjoyable reading, besides declaration of good law. Having said that, let me say one thing. The executive, legislature, judiciary, their powers, separation of powers, is there a Lakshmana Rekha? The answer is, there is a Lakshmana Rekha. But if that Lakshmana Rekha is crossed, what is the solution? And that's something which is really the subject matter of debate. And that's what Justice Chelameswar has adverted to in his own way. The most important aspect is that the constitutional framers, when they were confronted with creating this fantastic document, were aware that theory of separation of power was in absolute terms in the United States Constitution. But India, they did not want that strict separation of power theory to be incorporated in the Constitution. So they didn't do it. But having said that, I must say that Dr. Ambedkar was very crystal clear in his mind that as to what each of these organs of the state should be. And the Constituent Assembly debates provide extremely illuminating, answers to these questions. So Ambedkar said on 17 September 1949, and this is very important for us to remember, and I quote, "The Constitution is a fundamental document. It is a document which defines the position and power of the three organs of the state, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. It also defines the powers of the executive and the powers of the legislatures as against the citizens, as we have done in our chapter dealing with fundamental rights. In fact, the purpose of a constitution is not merely to create three organs of the state, but to limit their authority. Because if no limitation was imposed upon the authority of the organs, there will be complete tyranny and complete oppression. The legislature may be free to frame any law, the executive may be free to take any decision, and the Supreme Court may be free to give any interpretation of the law. It would result in utter chaos. These are the words of Dr. Ambedkar. And this is, in my respectful submission, both recognition of theory of separation of power and the Lakshmana Rekha that is imposed on these three organs of the state. So Constitution defines their powers, Constitution gives their roles. We need not go into details of them. But Parliament has absolute power to enact the laws, and the state legislatures have so far as the states are concerned. But and the executive is bound to implement those laws. Judiciary's role is now very interesting. It supervises both the executive action as to whether the executive is acting in terms of parliamentary or legislative laws or not, or is it in violation or breach of them. Secondly, judiciary also must decide when citizen questions the laws, whether the parliament law or the legislative law is constitutional. Does it violate fundamental rights? Is it violative of some of the provisions of the Constitution? If that be so, the judiciary has an absolute duty cast upon it to decide that this law is valid or not. So there is therefore a very interesting amalgam, I would say, of a separation of powers. And, it is separate, and yet in one sense, it is a trinity. And therefore, each organ in that sense depends on the other. But the problem arises when any one of the three organs tries to overstep its, jurisdiction. It doesn't happen with the judiciary, because as somebody has very brilliantly put it, and on this theory of, a theory of separation, Alexander Hamilton's words are very interesting. He says, whoever attentively considers the different departments of powers must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution, because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. Meaning thereby that political rights conferred under the Constitution can be interfered with mostly by the executive or by the legislature. The judiciary doesn't do it. At least, on theory, it doesn't do it. More often than not, it never does it. So it's very important. So as he says, that judiciary is the least harmful of the organs of the state. Now, this be so, what is really important for us to remember is that, and this is where, Ambedkar's prophecy really comes into play. Ambedkar was asked a question whether India will lose democracy, I think on 25th September 1949. And he said, yes, we will, if there is a landslide. Now, we have seen that when Mrs. Gandhi came into power with an absolute majority, democracy was under serious challenge. She imposed emergency and democracy virtually disappeared. And at a time like that, when the Supreme Court had to speak, in ADM Jabalpur's case, the Supreme Court didn't speak for us, the citizens. It allowed Mrs. Gandhi to trample with the fundamental rights and said that it is not subject to judicial review if fundamental rights are taken away during emergency. So that is something where judiciary failed us. But today we are now confronted with a situation where Prime Minister Modi, again like Mrs. Indira Gandhi, is a very popular leader. And Bharatiya Janata Party under his leadership has got absolute majority in parliament. So naturally, every powerful leader, political leader, and this experience is there for thousands of years, whether democratically elected or otherwise, always wants to amass more power. I mean, it was not a wrong statement when it was said 2,500 years ago that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It was a prophetic statement, because everybody likes to believe that when I am in power, what I am doing is for the good of the people. And therefore, if anybody questions that this is not for the good of the people, the person in power starts thinking that people are now trying to revolt against me. And therefore, I must stop these people. Now, this is very common, I think, human nature, which has translated into political realm for a long, long time. And every political leader or every king always likes to, or every emperor always liked to believe that what he was doing was absolutely, for the welfare of the people, for the good of the people. And for that, he could do whatever he wanted to do. So Muhammad Tughlaq felt that if the capital was shifted from Delhi to Daulatabad, even at a cost of lives of thousands of his people, he didn't care, because he felt that it would be wise to have the capital there so that, he can shelter from the attacks which were coming from the northwest. Now, it's very important, therefore, for us to remember that this kind of an, power today does give the Bharatiya Janata Party perhaps a justification to say that we think that it is right. Therefore, they can have laws like love jihads, for example. They can have law against so-called forcible conversions, religious conversions, and take action against thousands and thousands of innocent men, women, and children across the country. I mean, these are some of the examples. Demonetization was one act where, which hurt so many millions of people. 6 hours lockdown was another instance which hurt so many millions of people. But in both the cases, the Supreme Court failed us, the nation. So it's very important. Now, had the Supreme Court been proactive, had the Supreme Court performed its duty, I would say, its role as a custodian of the fundamental rights under the Constitution, and had Supreme Court reminded or mirrored to the executive and to the parliament the Lakshmana Rekha, then perhaps people could have been saved from the miseries that they went through. But it didn't happen. So there is undoubtedly a Lakshmana Rekha under the Constitution. Each of the organs must do, and they cannot travel outside the constitutional limitations. Take, for example, fundamental rights. Now, fundamental rights are not fundamental because they are provided as fundamental under the Constitution. These are basic human values which every civilized society must respect. Therefore, for example, you cannot take away liberty of a citizen without except in accordance with law. You cannot, curtail his freedom of speech. You cannot curtail his freedom of movement. You must allow him his religious beliefs, and you must allow him to practice the religion that he wants to. You must allow free press to survive and thrive in a democracy. These are all basic human values. Framers felt that it would be proper to put them as fundamental rights in Chapter 3, in Part 3 of the Constitution, because they feared that the executive and parliament will not realize their importance of these basic human values and may really take them away. Here comes the role of the judiciary, that when parliament passes a law which strikes at any of the fundamental rights, when executive takes any action which really takes away from even a single citizen his fundamental right, then judiciary has to step in and save the citizens from this kind of tyranny, this kind of unconstitutional laws. Now, this is where one has to really understand. And I mean, there are many checks and balances provided under the Constitution. For example, the federal structure, the role of the center and the states. Now, that's where again, the limitations come, that central government cannot make inroads into the powers which are expressly conferred upon the states. We are seeing that happening today time and again, that virtually every state is losing its powers to the center, and the central government is becoming more and more powerful. And in the garb of enacting laws, the central government is doing anything and everything that it thinks fit to do. For example, take the farm laws. The farm laws were, to my mind, actually in the realm of the state legislatures, but parliament passed the law. Fortunately for us, the citizens stood up, and citizens forced the central government, a mighty central government of the Bharatiya Janata Party, to withdraw those farm laws. Now, that is something which we have to remember, that this kind of exercise of powers today by the parliament at a time when Bharatiya Janata Party is extremely powerful. Prime Minister enjoys unparalleled popularity. And sadly, the opposition is not able to understand what the problems of people are and is not able to project the problems to people. It is not able to energize people into standing up and resisting unconstitutional laws or illegal and unconstitutional actions. The entire burden today lies for the failure or the state of today's nation at the doorstep of the opposition parties. Look at Israel today, where millions, and yesterday alone, 680,000 people in a small country like Israel across Jerusalem and many other cities stood up and have opposed Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial reforms, whereby he wants to protect himself against the charges of corruption, and he wants to say that judiciary cannot have the last word. Judges can't be appointed by judges themselves. We will appoint them. The defense minister of Israel has now publicly made a statement. President of Israel has made a statement against it, and 900 people who are soldiers, reservists, have now said nothing doing. They demonstrated in front of defense ministry and said that we will not join tomorrow when we are called upon to join the duty, because in this kind of nation where there are no laws, we will not be able to defend the nation. Now, that is the kind of a public opinion which is generated in our country. All these, what is happening today, the large-scale violations of human rights, large-scale attacks on political parties, large-scale attacks on the critics, including stand-up comedians, large-scale attacks on one and sundry. It is becoming really a reminder of extraordinarily, I would say, dangerous situation which is developing in the country. There are 3 instances which I can share with you in last 2 weeks that I have come across and I've had to defend in the Supreme Court. Is one, this example of this young law intern who was virtually kidnapped by by young people belonging to a certain right-wing group on the allegation that she was filming the court proceedings, taken to the police. The police then, files a FIR against her at the instance of this group, arrests her, produces her next day before the magistrate. Magistrate sends her for 4 days of remand. Nobody is there to defend her. Then when her bail application comes up, somebody goes from Delhi to defend her. They were all driven out. And then she spends time in jail from 20th January till 2 days ago, till Thursday. Now, just imagine for almost 2 months, over 2 months, she spends time in jail without there being any case against her. She has not violated any law. She has not committed any crime. And this happened in presence of a judge. So the police has failed. The judiciary has failed miserably. Now, another example, group of Christians who were celebrating, who were rather in prayers before Good Friday in a place called Fatehpur in Uttar Pradesh. Now, and there is a hospital which is 114 years old. These people were suddenly in the middle of the night attacked by a group of people, and they created ruckus. The police comes in, the FIR is filed by an individual, not by the police, alleging forcible conversion in the hospital. And the entire group of 37 people are arrested. They are released. But at what cost? Their liberty is taken away, their peace is taken away, their prosperity is taken away, their jobs are taken away. There is no security of life today in this country. Now, these kind of instances I have seen in Gujarat, where 15 years later, recently, a charge was filed against a Muslim group of people saying that you are guilty of forcible conversion. 15 years later, police would arrest them and they will spend months in jail. Nizamuddin Markaz is a classic example which I have again and again referred, where COVID sickness was criminalized. This group of people were worshipping in Nizamuddin area of Delhi, and COVID came. And some of them who had come from abroad perhaps were carrying COVID. And some of them had COVID. Fair enough. But over 500 people were arrested across the country, and they languished in jail for more than 6 months. So the police is guilty, the judiciary is more guilty, because the judiciary agreed for their arrests, justified them. and send them to first to remand, then to judicial custody. Now, what I feel is that, look, all these issues are creating today very serious debate for us to generate, namely the role of every institution. And the failure, real problem arises because of the failure of every institution, whether the executive, whether the legislature or the judiciary. The citizens are helpless. So this so-called Lakshmana Rekha is, wherever there is duty, there is power, it is coupled with the duty. So both power and duty must be exercised with great care and caution by each of these organs. It's not just that they have power, therefore they can go and do everything that they want. It's coupled with the duty to abide by the constitution, duty to abide by basic human values, duty to abide by other proprieties, other legalities, and duty to do only things which are in the larger welfare of the citizens in a true sense, not from the sense of view of the majoritarian party. No. So you have today a situation where the powers are very well alienated under the constitution, but the powers are not being well exercised. And as a result of that, the Lakshmana Rekha is being crossed virtually on a daily basis or hourly basis. Question is, are we as a nation strong enough to put checks on that crossing of Lakshmana Rekhas? And this is where real challenge before the country is. We don't have a perfect situation where any of the three organs can be said to be perfect today. Yes, judiciary is trying to do a lot, but judiciary is failing also a lot. And that's where, just imagine that if you take away from a 23-year-old young law intern her liberty for 2 months without any justification, can you ever compensate her? Or for that matter, that young boy, that famous actor Shah Rukh Khan's son, he was arrested without there being any drugs found on him. And yet he ended up spending almost over a month in jail. Now, you are destroying, therefore, people, permanently. You are destroying, taking away from them their dignity besides their liberty. And everybody will point a finger at them in society. So this kind of a situation is creating, take for example, these love jihad laws. Can love be ever a jihad? Love is love. And can you therefore now criminalize love? We have criminalized love because we think that as a majoritarian community, our girls should not marry boys from the minority community. Now, why then confine it to Hindus and Muslims? You might say Brahmin girl should not marry a girl from another caste, or a Baniya should not marry another, or a Rajput should not marry. Are we going to do all this in today's modern democracy, modern days? It's to be left to the wisdom of these young men and women who are geniuses, who are brilliant. Today's young generation is far more aware. And if they want to fall in love, let them fall in love. The state has no role to come. Now, this is where problems are arising. There are many such examples where state today is increasingly interfering with the private lives of citizens. In Gujarat, for example, there is a law which says that if you sell a house as a Hindu to a person belonging to the minority community, you have to take consent from the neighbors. And if the neighbors do not give consent, you can't sell. Now, just imagine a law like that. Everybody has a right of freedom of movement and freedom to reside anywhere he or she likes. But we have this law, and the law is titled Anekdhara Act. It says it's breach of peace to sell house to a person belonging to the other community. Now, there are some things which are happening in this country which are really not good. And it's very surprising because, Prime Minister has again and again extolled the values of democracy. He has again and again spoken about how tolerant and liberal our society has been and should be. And yet this is happening. Nobody is stopping. We have killed people because they were eating beef. We have now got a license to do anything and everything to do. As young men and women are just pouncing on people. Somebody is taking the cow to a doctor and they will be stopped and killed even before asking a question. But he's taking the cow to a doctor. He's not taking her to a slaughterhouse. But there is a power. Now that law is being, but these laws are now, democratized to such an extent that it has given freedom to this group of young people from belonging to certain fringe outfits to take law into their own hands and do whatever they want to do. So I personally feel, and that ultimately there is separation of powers. There are checks and balances in the Constitution, but sadly speaking, these checks and balances are not working as best or as strictly as they should be. As a result of that, we are seeing serious erosion in democracy and democratic values, and people's rights, including fundamental rights, are being seriously, interfered with, taken away, and permanent, I would say, harm is being caused to the democratic institution. So I feel that time has come for us as citizens to really understand what this Lakshmana Rekha is, and how, what steps should be taken when Lakshmana Rekha is crossed by any of the three organs of the state. Thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Both of your speeches, they have triggered a lot of questions, and the purpose of the debate was that to generate interest and start making people question. And I will pick up a question from one of the things what you said. When Mr. Tariq Nasir have asked, which institution is more responsible or protector of civil rights? As you mentioned, all of us are failing. So which institution you feel can be comparatively more responsible?
Well, to my mind, there is no doubt that judiciary is the most important institution to protect the liberties and the rights of the citizens. And it is judiciary alone which should have a last voice, and it has the last voice under the Constitution. And that's what Fundamental Rights chapter is, and that's what Articles 32 and Article 226 of the Constitution are. As you rightly began by saying that there is no point in having rights without remedies. So these remedies really tell us, because Article 32, for example, even Supreme Court has now forgotten really the value of Article 32, I must say very sadly. Because when people move the Supreme Court saying that my fundamental right is violated, Supreme Court says go to High Court. Now, there are judgments of the Supreme Court, Constitution Bench, Dario and other cases, where they have gone to the extent of saying that if fundamental rights are violated, it's the bounden duty of the Supreme Court to intervene. So if liberty of a citizen is under attack, then Supreme Court must step in at that very moment and stop the state or the legislature from doing something which is unconstitutional and interfering with that liberty. I have no two views about that. But I would love to hear what Justice Chelameswar says on this point.
See, in theory, I have no disagreement with Mr. Dave. The question is this: judiciary has a great responsibility in upholding the liberty and dignity of the people. The point is, the primary duty rests with the executive. The judiciary gives a declaration. Unless the executive respects the declaration and implements it, well, it remains on paper. And quite a few occasions we have seen that was quite a lot of these pious declarations simply remain on paper, nothing more happened thereafter. Now, the basic responsibility is with the executive. If the executive does not obey the Constitution or the laws or the judgments of the Supreme Court in a given case, the only remedy is ultimate appeal to the people, the electorate. And look at this, what is happening. Then it is for the people to correct the course, the democratic process. But the primary responsibility, in my view, is on the executive.
Thank you, sir. And you gave an example of Israel, and a question came on the issue of Israel, that can we hope the same situation in India if legislature crosses the Rekha as is happening in Israel?
I don't think our citizens are as politically conscious as in many other countries, and perhaps because of the compulsions of economic compulsions that citizens have, where most of the citizens have to work daily to earn their day's earnings and survive. And also illiteracy, which is another very serious challenge before this country. So unfortunately, the real problem is, as I said earlier, that it is the civil society which consists of educated people who are taken care of by their professions and by other work, who really have to take the lead. I mean, the doctors, lawyers, journalists, and all these other people, civil servants. It's them, along with, of course, the opposition parties, who have to raise the real issues. There is no point, all that the opposition is doing is attacking Prime Minister. I have not heard opposition going to the streets of every village, town and city saying that, what about your jobs? What about the price rise? I mean, there is no point, criticizing Prime Minister all the time as they are doing. I mean, they are making complete mockery. See, whether I agree with my Prime Minister or not, he is indeed my Prime Minister. And I can't lose my respect for the Prime Minister because I don't agree with his policies. That's not acceptable. And that's precisely what is happening today. So unless and until this kind of a consciousness comes, Israel has become extraordinarily conscious. See, the real problem in Israel, which India is facing in a very subtle way, is polarization. Mr. Netanyahu and his, this group of parties, political parties, which are supporting him, are extreme right-wing parties. And Israel, although we may think, and many of us have been told that Israel is extremely fundamentalist, Israel is not that fundamentalist. Israel is an extremely balanced society. And that's why you see these thousands and thousands of people who are on the streets against Mr. Netanyahu and his parties, supporting him. In India, there is today a serious polarization taking place. It's underneath, but it's affecting us very, very seriously. The division between the communities is becoming so complete in many parts. And all that you see is this narration all the time, which is directed against the minority community in political discourses, particularly in election states. Now, this kind of a polarization has to be stopped. We have to tell our political parties that we don't want this. All we want is solutions to our other problems. Where are my jobs? What about this price rise? What about rule of law? What about my housing? What about my schools? What about my hospitals? These are the issues on which we have to really generate a debate. And I must say, as a civil society, we have failed the country.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure it will satisfy everybody.
Justice Chelameswar was saying something. Justice Chelameswar.
Sir, I just wanted to say one thing. Srivastava himself later provided the answer. What happens is, it is the poverty which makes all the difference. Common man is simply concerned about his next meal. Until that is satisfied, that demand is satisfied, he'll have no, his liberty and all this dignity which we are talking about make no sense to him. No sense to him. It doesn't make any difference whether X is ruling this country or Y is ruling this country, so long as he is not getting his food. And whether the X or Y who is ruling the country has rational policies or irrational policies, they are not worried. Okay, they'll be worried when it personally touches them. But then some of these issues never touch most of these people personally. So therefore, they are not worried about it. On the other hand, as we have seen, the farm laws or something like that or earlier, if you recollect 1980 election, all of us, I think at least who are seen on the screen, we have seen the 1990 election. The election, one major issue on which the election was fought is the price rise of onions. If you recollect it, Mr. Dave, 1990, that made a difference to the election result because it touches the common man. They simply exercised their right of vote and then decided whatever they wanted to decide politically. That's what the situation which obtained in Israel may not obtain here because our economic and social conditions are totally different.
But there is also one additional factor, and that is a fear factor. Today, there is a very strong fear amongst people across the country as to retaliation. And we are seeing that retaliation is very common. Today, the government exercises extraordinarily, drastic powers. And, the use of the agencies like the CBI, the Enforcement Directorate, the income tax authorities, and the police at various states, especially in BJP ruled states, you can do anything that you want to. And because they are not checked by the judiciary, this kind of I would say extraordinarily harsh actions, totally unjustified actions of the authorities, go scot-free. And as a result of that, people are fearful, because the judiciary doesn't step in next day and say that release this man, release this boy. Why have you brought him? Why have you brought her? There is no case against them, because when a person is produced before the magistrate, the purpose of producing before a magistrate citizen who is arrested within 24 hours is to ensure that his custody is justified or not. Rarely does a magistrate exercise lawful power and his duty to see that he is rightly or wrongly exercised. Rarely. And today it's becoming very common to justify and certify everything that a policeman stands up and does before the court.
Mr. Dave, perhaps I beg to differ with you. I'm not saying the situation is wonderful now, but then it didn't start today. All the judicial power and the habeas corpus never came to the aid of Raman or Lohia, Jayaprakash Narayan, Murarji Desai, and none of even those days the same thing was happening.
Correct, I agree.
We were school-going kids those days, perhaps we didn't feel it. But since we are a little grown up today, we think something is going on. It started long back.
No, I agree with you, sir. It started long back.
Long back.
Gandhi was responsible for it. There is no doubt about it.
It's not that it's power, not individual. Power corrupts. Power corrupts the mind. I'm not talking about finance, the monetary corruptions. It's the mind, it influences the mind. As you pointed out rightly, everybody thinks he's doing the right thing, and anybody who's saying, opposing the ideas is a personal enemy. And then afterwards, in those days, Mrs. Gandhi days, it used to be the favorite tag is what is it? American agency, overseas operations agency. What is that secret agency? Something, not FBI, but one of the CA.
Yeah.
Anybody who was opposed to the ruling dispensation those days was a CA agent. If you recollect those days when we were in school.
In the 60s, in 50s and 60s. McCarthyan era.
No, in India, anybody who was opposing the ruling dispensation those days was called a CA agent. Today they say anybody who is opposing the ruling dispensation is anti-India. That's the only thing. Nomenclature changes, the pattern doesn't change, the modus operandi doesn't change. It all started long back, it continues. Only thing is for the people to protect their rights and be vigilant, that's all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. There are a few questions we have like to combine, and they have three facets of the same question. One is what is the basic framework? Secondly, how do we know that line has been crossed? And third, when the line has been crossed, what is the role of a citizen? Basic framework, when line has been crossed, and the role of a citizen.
No. See, the answer to the first question, what is basic framework? It's incapable of a one-line answer. Just to put it on the lighter wing, from the judicial system, there's a famous statement of one of the American Supreme Court judges in the context of law relating to obscenity, whether a particular work is obscene or not. Then the learned judge said, I can't define obscenity, but I know when I see it, he said. Similarly, when the line is crossed in the basic framework, it's not a one-line answer, is not possible in this. I'll just give you an illustration. Chelameswar case said democracy is a basic feature. Then the next question is, what is meant by democracy? Is it the Westminster model of democracy? Or is it the American model of democracy? There are various ways of democracy, various models of democracy. Which democracy they meant? The Supreme Court didn't say Westminster model. In fact, if you recollect, at some stage, Mrs. Gandhi tried, she floated an idea. There was a huge debate during the days of emergency, saying that we should shift to the presidential form of government where the Prime Minister is elected directly by the people. For various reasons, all opposition parties, in spite of all that was repression that was going on during the emergency, various political parties and various bodies of civil society, there was an opposition saying they don't, because everybody saw that that would go. The problem is with the perhaps the system. When that kind of a electoral process is covered in the American Constitution, the American civil society had the maturity which produced leaders who said we will not accept a third term, only 2 terms. To the best of my memory, I think there's only one president who had a third term. Mr. David, am I right? Third term during the wartime. No other president was. There's nothing specific about it in the Constitution. Do we have that kind of a democratic maturity in the country? Which is doubtful. So the consequences follow. Anyway, that first part of your question I have answered. The second and third, Mr. Dava will answer.
See, to my mind, basic features or essential features of the Constitution are many. Every part of the Constitution is important. And on a given day, in a given situation, even a least important part may appear to be very important. It's something, for example, Article 370. Now, Parliament has scrapped it. But from the perspective of the people of Kashmir, to whom a promise was given that, yes, before you take away Article 370 rights, the local assembly will be consulted. Now, to them, it might become a basic feature. So it all depends. There are so many such provisions in the Constitution, including financial provisions, which may appear to be very, very important. I think when our, right to property was taken away from the fundamental rights, I feel that it was a basic feature of the Constitution. Because if you don't treat right to property as a fundamental right, then what is left? But Mrs. Gandhi's government wanted it. And in fact, it was Janata government of Mr. Shanti Bhushan who brought that provision. So it's something very shocking. Every part of the Constitution has a role to play. And one must, understand that constitutional framers were so humble a group of people, geniuses, that they constantly reminded themselves that we are not truly a representative body. We have not been elected by a very wide franchise across the country. But this is what we think is good for India, which is going to be good for India. And we make this constitution and give it to its people. They will have a right to amend it in future. Now, the debate shows that the power of amendment was supposed to be absolute under the Constitution. Ambedkar said that we have no right to put any kind of a burden on future generation. And every generation must have a right to choose its constitution. But it is the Supreme Court fearing that our modern day politicians will try and take away every important right of the citizen, that they invented this theory of basic structure or essential features. And rightly so. Because in today's body polity, if this restriction is not there, if this restraint is not there, then I think constitution will become, a document which will be only worth a waste paper basket. Because the powers those in power really don't care. They think that they are doing the right thing for the welfare of the people. So to them, this constitutional provision should not come in the way. But to us, citizens, it's important. So I think, therefore, everything is a constitution, is basic. And as and when it is, violated, as Justice Chelameswar says, you can't really define it in one line or in a given situation or by given example. I mean, any kind of an infraction must attract, some kind of a reaction by citizens. So those rights are inviolable, and anytime the rights are violated, I think citizens must stand up and revolt against it.
Thank you, sir. One of our listeners, as you mentioned, Dr. Ambedkar, he has quoted Dr. Ambedkar. He mentioned, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. Is the present time the brightest reflection of this axiomatic statement? So, your call, sir.
Well, it's very interesting. Both Dr. Rajendra Prasad President of the Constituent Assembly and the first President of India, one of the greatest sons of soil, and Dr. Ambedkar had repeatedly warned during Constituent Assembly debate that we don't know whether the Constitution will survive and in what form. It will depend on the people. It will depend on the political parties. And it will depend on what kind of representatives the people choose. And it will also depend whether man becomes vile or not. So we are today confronted with this situation where nothing, nothing can be said. Their prophecies have come out to be true. But yet we are not able to realize that, because today it's very easy to influence our judgment when we go forward by religious matters, by extremely irrelevant issues. Our minds can be easily deflected. And this is where the real challenge is, that political maturity, we must realize that religious matters are to be discussed at home and in our hearts, not in public affairs. But it is happening. So, yes, we are, the prophecies of these two great leaders are turning out to be so true. They turned out to be true when Mrs. Gandhi was in power, and they are turning out to be true even today. So I think one has to be very careful about what's happening in the country. And one hopes that, Prime Minister who enjoys such a great popularity, perhaps will rethink and, reinvent himself, and perhaps might guide his party, which is today the largest party in the country and is there to stay for a long, long time, in the right direction. And perhaps Prime Minister will tell his partymen that we must adhere to the constitutional values and ethos in letter and spirit, and not just in letter. And, it would be very important for them to understand that, take, for example, the minorities treatment. It's something we must, we fought for almost 20 years. The Sikhs as a minority community felt alienated, and we had very serious issue of fundamentalism. We don't want that kind of a situation emerging today with the other minorities. So it is for the leader, as tall as Mr. Modi is. I may disagree with what he does. I criticize his policies all the time and his actions. But I still feel that as the leader who is here to stay for a long time, he must reinvent, and he must, take this country in a new direction, a real direction where everybody can prosper without, caste, creed, community, and religion. And everybody gets the benefit of, collective action and the collective, I would say, strength of the country. And that's where we can make a progress. Otherwise, we can't make a progress.
Sir, so let me take another question. And it's a very interesting question. Does Lakshmana Rekha shift depending upon the political situation? If a political party in power is very strong, there he starts pushing the Lakshmana Rekha. And if the establishment is weak, it's a coalition government, it is the otherwise. So the boundaries are not fixed. They keep on changing depending upon the political scenario. So.
Justice Lakshmana.
In reality, yes. In theory, no. But what happens in reality? We have seen it number of times. We have seen it. Because I am 70 now. I have seen it more than once. They were slightly younger than me. Srivastava, I don't know. Maybe we all belong to the same age bracket. We have seen it a number of times. In theory, no, it can't change. It can't shift. But in practice, it does. It does. But one thing. As students of law and history, we must remember, this doesn't, it is the nature of power. It didn't happen only in this country. If you study the American history, at some point of time, the presidents, American president, because the American president stand on a slightly different footing than our president. Something more akin to our prime minister, and maybe a little more also. Saying that the judiciary was crossing the Lakshmana Rekha, to use the same expression. Then a proposal was made to pack the court, that these judges are, for every sitting judge, 2 more judges will be appointed. If there are 9 judges, another 18 judges will be appointed. That means these 9 people become simply a minority if the government chooses 18 judges of its choice. But The point is, after that, though the threat was never really put into executed, but that threat itself worked. American Supreme Court, after that statement, never interfered with the economic decisions of the Parliament and the President. That is an area which they said, no, hands off, we will not deal with it. Prior to that, the 3 laws made by the Congress were invalidated by the Supreme Court. 3 or 4, I don't remember exactly. 3, if I remember right. Usually there is a famous quip said, all the 9 judges of the Supreme Court, American Supreme Court, reinvented themselves, corrected the course. So the quip is a switch in time that saved 9. Court packing never took place. Their orientation just changed. That's all. So these things happen. These are all democratic practices. That's how democracies work. As the only quote I'm very fond of making repeatedly is that Lawrence Tribe is a professor of constitution law in Harvard University. He wrote a wonderful treatise on American Constitution. In the preface, he says, the long quote, I don't want to go into it. It says, such passing finality as the judgments of the Supreme Court have is essentially a compromise between order and chaos, he says. Nothing is final. In a democracy, this experiment goes on, and so long as we have basic respect for the system and basic respect for the institutions, that is retained, an error here, an error there, occasionally, well, maybe but somebody who is enduring something which is not very pleasant, it may look very insufferable. But look at it from a larger perspective. The democratic process, it goes on. Correction will come sometime. Those of us who lived during the period of emergency, in fact, I may tell you a personal anecdote. I was in final year law when emergency was involved in this country. For no reason, nothing happened to me. I was happy, nobody arrested me, nothing. I was under some surveillance, that's a different matter. But I felt distressed. I went to my constitutional law professor, which I had just completed that subject at that point of time, completed the examination, not the study of constitution. I went and asked him, sir, what is it? What is the use of all this constitution? I said, an elderly man, an experienced man, in fact, he retired with our badge. He smiled and said, gentlemen, I have seen Hitler. He stopped it there. A very cryptic answer. So even this shall pass. That's what he said. That's what happens.
Should I take another question? Somebody has opined, if reasonable overlap is justified, when constitutional rights are infringed, when intervention by judiciary is infringed, at what level judiciary will come and set this far and no further?
It's a constant process. It's not at any particular given point of time. Every action, executive or parliamentary, is subject to judicial scrutiny. Judicial review is basic feature of the Constitution of India. And therefore, if tested, every action will have to be justified by executive or the parliament. And if they fail to justify within the parameters of the Constitution, the Supreme Court is bound to say that it is unconstitutional. So it's a constant, process. It's a constant watch, and it's never, never ending. And it will continue to be so long as the kind of executive and kind of politicians we have who are constantly wanting to, get more and more powers and make citizens more and more weak in front of them. So this is a process which is always going to go on.
Thank you, sir. While quoting Ambedkar, one of our learned listener has moved to Avanshuri. And he has quoted saying, Supreme Court should behave as if it is at war with the executive in defense of Constitution. And his question is, are the founding fathers visualize such role in the judiciary as at war with the executive? Is it possible under the present constitution?
Well, undoubtedly, the constitutional framers were very conscious about the abuses by the state, by the executive at that point of time, even in 1947, 1948. And they spoke about these excesses by the authorities. And that's why they really conferred upon us the fundamental rights, because they felt that citizens' rights are, citizens are being ill-treated at that point of time also. So they gave the fundamental rights with that in mind. So therefore, they were conscious that the rights must be there. And Ambedkar was more conscious that rights must be also protected by legal remedies. That is why Article 32 itself is a fundamental right. And Ambedkar says, in fact, that if I had to put my finger on any one article of the Constitution without which Constitution is a failure, it is Article 32. So, right to enforce fundamental right is a basic feature of the Constitution. And I think this struggle goes on constantly. I mean, it's nothing, never ending. It happens all the time. And unfortunately, this is going to happen so long as, we have a state and we have the three organs. There is never an ideal society. There is never a truly welfare society as is contemplated. It is always welfare of the few and always, benefit of the few, and the majority has to suffer. That's been a struggle of mankind for thousands of years. We can't change it in 75 years, can we?
I think, Srivastava, can we close it here? I have some other commitment.
Yeah, one question and then we will close it. One question has come again. If we can choose policy of the government, when government recommends X number of judges for the posting, some judges are picked, some judges are not picked. So what can be done about it?
Well, I choose to maintain silence on this. I spoke 5 years back, and afterwards I don't wish to speak anything about it. Let Mr. Dave speak about it.
Sorry, what did you ask the question?
Sir, the question was about the present day when Supreme Court recommends, say, 5 judges, and ultimately the appointment order will come only for 2 or 3, and 2 are again left. And again, it comes back to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court again recommends. So the process is going on for now quite some time. What can be done about it?
I can only say one thing, that the judges, and without any disrespect to Justice Chelameswar, whom I hold very highly, and other judges, past and present, whom I have always respected, I feel that basically they have not understood the ambit of the power that they have, taken upon themselves under the second judge's judgment. They themselves very categorically said, while taking away the power from the executive and saying, we will now appoint judges, that we will select the best from those amongst available. Now, is it happening? The answer is no. They are not selecting the best from those amongst available. I have seen it right from 1993, but either from the bar or even from the lower judiciary to the Supreme Court, from the high courts to the Supreme Court. We have not always selected the best. They are constantly compromising. There is constant give and take within the collegium system. And that's something which is a matter of great concern. And I mean, because of that, I have been a very serious critic of the collegium system only because of that, nothing else. So, but the choice is very difficult, because if you leave it to the executive, we are now seeing what kind of, people are being appointed in high constitutional offices like governors and CAG and election commission. I mean, those are the kind of appointments which we'll end up getting in high courts and Supreme Court. So yes, I mean, the judges will have to really tighten the powers and act in letter and spirit of their judgment.
Thank you, sir. So I think with that, we can close our this discussion, because the speeches have created a lot of churning, and that was the purpose, that it should be a very thought-provoking, and that it was there. So let me call Sri Ravi Babu, who started the talk, to thank our honored guest.
Thank you, sir. It's well, what to say? Yes, one of the commentators said it's a mind-blowing and enriching experience this whole of this webinar has been. The speakers had been very erudite, and because they have dealt with these topics and they have been very, very articulate in expressing their views. And so for this, I thank Justice Chelameswar and Sri Dushyant for accepting our invite and giving our audience a very good, insightful thoughts on the topic. And I also thank moderator Sri A.K. Srivastava for his wonderful introduction and also the way he conducted the proceedings. Of course, we have still a lot of questions which are left out, but being due to the paucity of time, we are unable to handle them. Maybe we will see how to address these questions. I also thank my design team and the technical team consisting of Sadiq Ali and Shreya Rao for their wonderful poster design and the technical support. And at the end, I thank the audience quite a lot because they have come from all over the country, all over the world. And there is a lot of presence of journalists and advocates indicating the interest in the current topic. With this vote of thanks, we close the session. Before we close the session, as the usual practice is, our next topic is on Indian growth story. Why has employment failed to keep pace? It is scheduled on 30th of April. The time will be intimated to you separately. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.